Empty vessels. What are they meant to be filled with? Through Lent, our focus was on emptying. We emptied ourselves of emotions, behaviors, thoughts, even physical items that were limiting our ability to fully be open with the Spirit of God. You may remember we had bowls of water with rice paper where we would write down different things we wanted to empty ourselves of. And as the paper dissolved in the water, so did our worries, our anxieties. They no longer existed for us to carry. Now we come into Eastertide. We had Easter last week. We now go through 6 weeks of Easter before Pentecost. And we're empty. Just like the tomb, we're empty. But that's not our purpose. Our purpose is not to just sit as empty vessels, as decorations on a mantle or a shelf. We do have a purpose. So we're supposed to be filled with something, but what is it? I propose that the first step in getting to that process is first knowing what are we made of. There's all kinds of types of containers in our lives. We know that. We have glass. It's really good for liquids. Can even hold solids. It's really breakable though. We all have broken glasses. We have wooden or woven wooden. And they're pretty good for solids, especially big things. Too small and they're going to fall through the cracks and whatnot. And they're good for breads and fruits, but I wouldn't put your meat in it. And they're pretty sturdy, but very flammable. And don't get it in water because the wood rot, you don't want that. We also have plastic. Pretty watertight usually, until it cracks. Or it says dishwasher safe and it's not. Not to mention it's really kind of bad for the environment to make it. And you know how difficult it is to secure once you actually get something in, trying to get the lid to stay on. Not working. Easily destroyed. Dishwasher, hot stove, thrown out the car, whatever. We also have stoneware. I'm guessing probably 95% of us all use a coffee mug in the morning. We use them here. We're a green church, so we try our best to use reusable cups. This one's marked made in China. Keep that in mind for later. But the point I want to make about stoneware, earthenware, clay, pottery, whatever name you want to give it, is it's the most mentioned material in the Bible. A quick look in the Strong's Dictionary shows at least 50 occurrences of the word pot, potter, pottery, clay, vessel, and earthenware. In Hebrew, the word translated as clay is also translated as dust, mud, or earth. That may bring to mind Genesis and the creation of Adam. So there's lots of references in our scriptures about clay and pots and vessels, and partly because it was common. Everyone could relate to it because everyone used it. Everyone had pottery and clay vessels. Everyone knew how the water had to get from the stream to the village. It held liquids, solids, different shapes and sizes from plates to cups to jugs. It's made from the earth with really no damage done to the earth. And sturdy. It can be made to be nearly indestructible. I know most of us have broken a coffee mug here or there, but I'll tell you a story. When I was in one of my pottery courses, I presented one of my items. It was actually this one here. And I had my professor look at it, and he goes, "Wow, don't drop this." I was like, "Is it that fragile?" He goes, no, I don't want you to break the tiles of your floor. So they can be made to be nearly indestructible. And we know this because we know lots of ancient cultures exist, and the only reason we know they exist is from their pottery artifacts. As I was preparing this week, I was thinking about the prevalence of pottery throughout ancient cultures. And Friday, I happened to go to the art museum with one of my clients, so I made sure to look out throughout the exhibits and notice the pottery, which I usually do anyway. But I realized that from the Americas to Asia to Africa, everybody had pottery. And really, when you looked at how they were made, their shapes, their general construction, they were all very similar. Thousands of miles apart, and yet they all have a similar composition. They differed, though, in decoration, sizes, purpose. Some were whistles, some were dolls, some were jugs. And they each had their own culture and the earth of that region. Today we heard 3 different scriptures, 3 different examples of the mentioning of clay, potters, and jars. The original focus for today's message came from the Corinthians text of the clay jars and the treasure within them. But as I thought deeper, I wondered, how can we know what the treasure is if we don't know what it's made of? Then Jeremiah talks of the potter's house and the potter at the wheel. So I consider myself a novice potter, nowhere near professional, but I know how to throw a pot. I began in high school, did it again in college, and had a membership to a studio in Wichita. Pottery is a spiritual practice for me, and one that's so intense that words often come short of explaining it. So, I have visual help to explain things today. So, first you start with dust, dirt, dry clay. Too much water and you must wait for it to dry out again. Not enough and the clay cracks. No elasticity. And then there's additives. There's grog, which is a common name for it today, or a sandy additive, which adds strength. Very, very common in antiquity to have.
Which button do I push?
B.
What's that?
B.
B.
Okay.
Awesome.
So once you have it mixed, you have a moist, formable clay. But you must knead it, or the ceramic term is wedge it. Now this builds up your arm strength. You mix it, just like they're showing there, to get the air bubbles out. Because air bubbles are disastrous for a pot. This tiniest air bubble, when it gets hot in the kiln, that air expands and it will blow your pot to smithereens. So you wedge it. It also helps create an even texture, blends the colors together. Tap.
Oops, I hit B again.
Hit me again. And then arrow over. There we go. So once you've got it wedged and you've got it all set, now you're ready to put it on the wheel. But it's not that simple. You can't just put it on and make your pot. There's a whole process to it. You have to center it, which means literally pushing the center of the clay into the center of the wheel. Again, arm muscles. If it's off center, it leads to a lopsided vessel and uneven walls, and the chances of it surviving are very slim. You also must use enough water to keep your hands smooth, so that as the pot spins around, your fingers don't catch it and mar it, which is what Jeremiah saw in the potter's house when the potter was making it, it was marred, it wasn't right. But you can't use so much water that the clay loses its strength either. Otherwise, you've lost your vessel. You have to apply an even and equal pressure. Slow and steady. Keep your arms close to your body. And the key to all of pottery is patience. You cannot rush the process. You can't always force the clay into what you want it to be either. Clay has a mind of its own, I tell you. If it doesn't want to be a coffee mug, it won't be a coffee mug. It's a relationship with the clay. You have to know the clay. And you use all 5 senses through the process. You hear the slush of the water. You see the placement of your hands, your tools. You smell the earth that's in front of you. You taste the dust in the air. And you feel the clay in your hands. You feel for bubbles. Pop them down. You feel for the thickness. Are the walls thick enough? Are they too thick? Too thin? Is the texture right? Does it have the look that you want it to have? Now you let it dry. Dry to a leather-hard state. This is key. This was a bowl that I didn't have the patience for, and I rushed the process and didn't wait for it to be leather-hard before I trimmed it, and it became a bowl plate of some sort. This was my lesson in patience. This part's always the hardest for me, waiting for it to dry. There's ways that you can speed up the drying. You can set it in the sun, which is what many of the ancient potters would have done, but you can also use hair dryers. Done that before. But it's not even, and sometimes then you get really dry spots in one spot, and really, patience. Let it dry on its own. And when it's dry to that leather-hard state, now you can decorate it. Trimming it, carving it. This is when you get to have that creative piece of the whole process. Then you go to a greenware firing. This is after the clay is bone dry. It's fired at a low temp, removes the moisture from the clay, makes it hard but very fragile. Most people think once the clay is fired that it's strong and sturdy. But this is done at such a low temp that it doesn't really bring out all the qualities of it. Then you glaze and you paint. Glazing is like adding a liquid coat that will become like glass armor. Colors, designs, whatever look you want. Glazing the inside for food vessels so that it's food safe. Then you glaze fire, which is a much higher temp. It melts the particles in the glaze and glassifies them. And here's a bonus Jeopardy fact for you. Most people don't know that glass is actually earthenware that's just been heated to extreme temperatures and makes glass. It's all from the same earth. And there you have your finished product. Various sizes, various shapes, various purposes. Now, why did I take the time to explain this process, you may ask? Ceramic items for us are usually made in bulk, out of molds, so they all look the same and we have matching sets. But the importance of knowing this process helps us to understand the passages. In our culture, we think of pottery as a hobby or a craft, not a wage-making career. In antiquity, to be a potter was a trade, an art, and very important for the community. The potters spent their life working with the earth between their fingers. Everyone from the poorest to the richest would use the vessels that the potter made. When we pick up our coffee mug in the morning, I'm willing to bet the majority of us don't think about where it came from. We're only worried about what's in it. But who made it? Who mixed the dust with the water? Who poured the liquid clay into the molds? Who lit the fire in the kiln? Who poured the glaze across it? For those in the biblical stories, they knew who made their cups, their jugs, their vases. There was respect for the potter and thus respect for the vessel. If a vessel was made for a specific purpose, for example, maybe to hold anointing oil, then nothing else could ever be placed in that vessel. And they respected that. We as a culture have difficulty understanding that in our postmodern society. We struggle even more to understand the passage from Jeremiah about the marred clay. I mentioned earlier the marred clay, when it's on the wheel and something happens, earthquake perhaps, or even just a sneeze. Anything that causes a finger to dive too far in and completely destroys the vessel. Sometimes it even cracks while it's drying. But marred clay is not lost. Clay can be reworked until it is fired in a kiln. Up until then, anything can be reconditioned and reworked. If the clay is wet, you let it dry, and then you start again. Wedging, sintering. People in antiquity understood that their cup may have been the 5th form, 6th form, 10th form of a particular piece of clay. Unless you're a master potter, it's pretty difficult to ensure that each vessel makes it to the kiln the first time. They understood the frustration that could be had through this process. Imagine having a day where everything you try and throw just falls apart. Today, our cultural standard is that if something breaks, you throw it away and buy a new one. There's no thought to the artist who created it, no thought to the sweat and the love that's poured into it. And my point in all of this is that people in antiquity valued their pottery. They valued the work and effort, the materials, the purpose. What would it be like for us if we valued our pottery just as much? What would your morning cup of coffee taste like if you thought of the Creator? 2 Corinthians told us that we have treasure in clay jars. Think back to Genesis, the story of Adam. God forms from the earth Adam and breathes life into Adam, earth, clay. Adam is made of clay. Adam is a clay vessel, a clay jar. We are each a clay jar, and the treasure is in us. But if we compare us as clay vessels to the process of creating them on a wheel, like I showed, there's a slightly different process. We don't get dried out. We don't get put into a kiln to be hardened. We're kept malleable. Jeremiah said, from the Jeremiah text, God spoke, "Can I not do for Israel what the potter does with the clay?" God is never finished with us. We're never ready to be hardened. We can be reformed, reworked, recreated. The treasure is in us. So if we are moist, malleable clay, then what could we possibly hold? Not liquid. That would dissolve the vessel, lose its strength. Can you think of times in your life when you've tried to hold liquids, things that easily flowed or leaked? Relationships, grudges. We can't hold solids because we're too weak to carry it. We're not hardened. Have you had times when you tried to carry more than you were capable? Workload, burdens, anxiety. And we can't hold gases because we have no lid. We have no way of sealing it in. It will escape. And I know I've had times when I've tried to hold on to things that I couldn't hold on to, but tried desperately to hold on to it anyway. What then is the treasure that Paul is alluding to that we hold in our clay jars? I propose that the treasure is God's love. As the Corinthians text says, we are afflicted, but not crushed. Perplexed, but never to the point of despair. We may be hurt, but we're not abandoned or destroyed. During Lent, we worked to empty ourselves, our vessels, of the liquids, the solids, the gases. Now we have room to fill ourselves with what we are intended and created to hold, the love of God. It's disrespectful to the Creator to fill our vessels with things it's not intended to hold. It's disrespectful to the Creator to keep empty as a decoration, a mantelpiece. Just as the Isaiah text reads, "O Lord, you are our Creator. We are the clay, and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand." Amen.